This is the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Jason. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Lowell Francis. Hi, Lowell.
Hello.
This is our monthly Gauntlet Hangouts Roundup episode, and this month we are joined by community member and game master, Kyle Thompson. Hi, Kyle. Welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast.
Hello, and thank you.
So, listeners, we are going to discuss some of the games that we played in March. We are going to look ahead to some of the games that are on the Gauntlet Hangouts calendar in April, and then we're going to finish up, as always, with Giving Me Life. Let's get right to it. Lowell, how was your March?
Pretty good. Off Gauntlet, did Blades in the Dark, Action Cards, Godbound, Fellowship, 13th Age, and 7th Sea. And then in Gauntlet, did Apocalypse World, set on Tatooine, that Rich Rogers has run for the Star Wars Saturday. Familiars of Terra, did a one-shot of that, which really dug. The ongoing Mutant Year Zero thing, which is what I'm going to talk about. And it was also my Cypher System month, so I ran Gods of the Fall and Predation and Unmasked. And I'm still processing the Cypher stuff, so I actually want to focus on Mutant Year Zero, and in particular, the question of longer-term play with an open table. So Mutant Year Zero, I've talked about it before. It's post-apocalyptic. It definitely has a meta story, so that's kind of built into the game. It's a mix of hexcrawl and settlement activity, and it's very much Tridindle. It's a little bit trad, but it's certainly taking a lot from story game systems and approaches. So this is the first time we've done a quarterly game. That's 13 sessions spread over 3 months, which means 3 periods for signups. So we ended up with 10 different players across those sessions. 2 players played in all of them. 1 player played in most of them. And then, we had another 7 other players that played from time to time. And it was challenging. I think it worked, and I really enjoyed the games. We had all these sessions, and we did develop a story over the course of that. A couple of the players had significant arcs where their characters changed and evolved, and they had to make choices about where they were going to go, which I felt good about, with enough room to breathe, like you might get in a longer campaign a little bit. The community and the setting felt real, but here's the thing. The biggest problem, and I've talked about this for people who are thinking about doing the open table, a challenge, it's obvious, but it's worse than you probably imagine. Getting new players in, making them feel connected, and giving them stakes, giving them ties, and most importantly, making sure that they don't have to have institutional knowledge, that the other players aren't leaning into shit that has already been talked about, and we're focusing on that. And that's hard. So the first person we had new was Asher S., and he put up with a lot because I hadn't quite gotten my feet under me about how much we needed to prep, how much we could do the character creation at the table, how much we could just do the processes we had already done. And so we threw him at the table and kind of left him a little bit dazed and confused. He rolled with it, but I'd certainly underestimated what that was going to take.
Was it a situation where you had him do the character creation like right there at the beginning of the first session that he was in?
Well, I'd given him some information about making those choices and the character sheet and things like that, but my default is never to expect that the players read anything I send them. But there's stuff where you have to make like relationship picks and some choices about skills and some other things that I ended up later on narrowing because they were more confusing than they were additive. They didn't draw him into the setting. Rather, it made him go, okay, what's going on? Who are all these names? What are all these people? And so I ended up later, after that, sending an email that said, here is where we're at. Here are the characters that we have on the table. Here is what are the options. Here are ones that are probably going to be more or less useful for the session you're coming into, and kind of here's generally where we're at. And I think streamlining that approach is really important. If there's fiddly bits on character creation, things that might not happen at the table, throw them away. Throw away everything that is dead weight. Anything that is like character choices, relationship questions like from PBTA, those kinds of things. Have the other players say, here are our NPCs that we've already got out here that we're connected to. Can you connect to those? And that allows those other players to talk about the background in an informative way, and then lets the new player kind of make those choices and connect to them.
Interesting.
The other thing I did is it's a stat and skill system. So I said, you don't have to set any of those. Here's how many points you have. Set them on the fly. I don't care. If it comes to a roll, if you want to put all your points into it, I don't care. So that they could be reactive and not like make choices and then go, oh crap, I wish I had done this. Especially if they're going to play in just 1 or 2 sessions. Why straitjacket them in that case?
That actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think that there's no reason not to do it. I mean, quite honestly. And I don't, if the players are going to be there for just a couple of sessions, I don't want them to regret choices. I think that's really, really important. So I think all that worked and has in the later sessions been better. Players have gotten in quicker. There are a couple of things that make this work, in particular for Mutant Year Zero, and I think for some other games. One is, I think for this to function in the way that I'm doing it, where it's, 13 sessions straight through, rather than like broken up arcs or thematic arcs or things like that, there has to be a shared object. There has to be a shared institution. In the case of Mutant Year Zero, there's an arc, and everybody belongs to the arc, and the arc is larger than them, but they still get to make choices about it. There are these projects they do to build it up, and they set some things about it, but it's a bigger thing than they are. And then when new people come in, they can contribute to that, and they can feel like they're part of it. I'm doing Blades in the Dark for the second quarter, and in the case of that, it will be the crew. The crew is the larger institution that holds on to that. David Rothfeder is running Night Witches, and he just talked about the fact of the institution of the Air Force as being that squadron is a larger thing than the players. It's not a D&D party. It's not some abstract concept. It's a solid thing. And so in Worldwide Wrestling, it'd be the promotion. If we did Star Trek, I think it would be the big ship, bigger than those, like in mystery games where you have a patron or patron organization. Those are very loose. I think you need something bigger and more substantial for that to work. The other thing that I'll mention is Mutant Year Zero really helped with playing out this game because it is partial Hexcrawl, and it's also baked into the rules that as a GM, you should not plan anything. You should absolutely not. What you need to do is an hour or so before the game, you roll a threat or draw a threat, and then you figure out how that's going to play out. I mean, it's a little bit like Dogs in the Vineyard or some of these other things where you just get some minimal stuff before the game, and you figure that out, and you connect it to what you've already got there. If they go out into the zone, there's plenty of random tables that'll generate awesome shit. And that really works because it makes the sessions, any particular little arc of a threat was done in 1 session or 2 sessions. So we got these little arcs. There's a bigger arc running through, but there's repeated victories. So anybody who's stopping in for a bit is getting something cool happening when we get to that.
It's super interesting. To some extent, I think this is a situation where system matters a little bit more than play culture matters.
Yeah.
I do think, like you said, certain systems, and I'm sure Kyle can speak to this, Blades in the Dark seems almost built for how we run games in the Gauntlet, right? I mean, the idea of the shared crew that actually has stats that are tracked, right, that anybody can have access to, automatically like helps a new player get up and running. The mission oriented play where we're kind of like zooming in and zooming out of like key moments in the crew's history. I think that all works, to sort of facilitate that type of play. And so I do think the game that you pick for open table campaign matters a lot. And, for me, I've got Mercy Falls, which is Monster Hearts, and I've got We Hunt the Keepers, and then before that, Company of the Three Kings for Dungeon World. And, I kind of like plan for open table campaign play, right? I try to hang the campaign on like something other than like a straight, one beat after another linear continuity, right? Like I have to have it has to function a slightly different way for open table campaign to work. So for example, in Mercy Falls, for those 3, 4, 5 sessions of any given series on our calendar where I have X group of players, or I should say where I have a certain group of players, that is a contained story, right? That's a contained story in the Mercy Falls mythos. And if you know Mercy Falls, if you've participated in previous series, or if you have listened to YouTube videos or the podcast or whatever, then you get a certain extra bonus satisfaction out of playing in it. But you're still going to have a good time, even if you don't know anything about Mercy Falls, because we're doing one capsule moment in time in Mercy Falls history, right?
Right. And here's the thing. Any of those games that I mentioned, Blades in the Dark, Star Trek, Worldwide Wrestling, all have a very easy to do episodic arcs. Okay, that's a mission, or that's a job, or that's a show. Those all have those little arc breaks. One of the things I think that was striking for me is for the players that played through most of the sessions, or all of the sessions in the case of 2 of them, they were getting arcs that kind of solved things maybe a little bit faster than they expected, or because we're still kind of playing on online time, but they also had more room to breathe. I mean, it is one of the things about campaign play. When you're at the table, you get time to think about, let it breathe. You don't have to be pushing the pedals as fast, and you can look at problem solving, I think, a little bit more. A couple of challenges I do want to mention for this. If your instinct as a GM is completely hands off, I think that's a real challenge. I know that Shane was kind of talking about being very, very open with that today in the Slack thing. And I think that's really interesting, especially with the Hexcrawl model he was talking about. In the case of what I was doing, and the case I think that GMs need to be aware of, you're going to have to stop and step in and hard frame stuff.
Yes. Right.
Still, we're doing collaborative or doing shared things, but I'm getting in there to move my pieces into place, and I'm being explicit. Okay, I really want to get him in with this, and so if you're not comfortable with that, this may not be as a useful an approach for you.
Well, can we unpack that a little bit? Like when you say like it being a complication of online play, what do you mean by that?
I think that because often in online play, we've got 2.5, 3 hours, and we've also got a break, and we've also got some time taken up by technical stuff. So that's a compressed time period, right? I think that I'm more given to hard framing, to pushing to go, okay, let's get to here. Let's get to this. Whereas when I'm running face to face at the table, I'm much looser about that, because we do have the time and we do have the space. And I know I'm going to have everybody back the next week, and I know it's going to be the same set of players.
Got it. Oh, so you mean like online, the way we schedule it, right? Because presumably you could have like the same group of people in an online context, right? Like, but an open table online context, yeah, sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say that. But I think a lot of people are running the way we are with kind of changeable stuff. So the other sort of sticking point, this is something that Maria brought up online in regard to OSR and games with levels and games with power gradations. One thing about Mutant Year Zero is it's a few points, you get a new talent, you get some more skill levels, that kind of thing. The players, even as they advance, retain a relative parity. And the same thing, I think, with Blades in the Dark. But, in later players, I'm going to give them some more points. I think that you honestly, if you're going to do this, you have to give up on the whole idea of leveling. And that, okay, these players have played for X sessions, so they deserve to get to level 5. Other players don't. Other players are going to have to level up to that. I think give that up, bring in new players at that level, at whatever the lowest level of the lowest player is. Tell the group you're going to do that. Be explicit and open about it, because you're just there to have fun.
It's so funny because a lot of the things you're talking about as far as like how to make this work and adjustments and maybe even, dare I say, compromises to make open table campaign play work. A lot of those things are things that kind of that don't exist in Powered by the Apocalypse games. I think it's really interesting that Powered by the Apocalypse games, for example, it doesn't matter like what level the characters are, right? Or how many advancements they've had relative to each other. You mentioned earlier about like the logistics of getting a new character up and running, right? Or a new player up and running. PBTA games, a playbook takes about 5 minutes to fill out, right? I usually do like for Monster Hearts, for example, I do their backstory questions and just theirs, and then that's the end of it. And I might give them one NPC to add to the mix, but it kind of depends. But yeah, so I think that's a really interesting part of this conversation, right? Which is, like I said earlier, like I think the game selection really does matter a lot there. You know? Now the things but for Mutant Year Zero, I don't know much about that system. And I guess my question for you is do you feel like you're missing something? For example, if you don't emphasize leveling, or if you just give a brand new person as many levels as they need to be along with everybody else?
No, because it's about the fun is the exploring, and everybody is screwed because that game is brutal. and regardless of how many points or talents or whatever you have, you're still going to be behind the 8 ball on that. Here's the thing is, the other players, the existing players, want competent people. They want players who can survive and do things and get things done. It's not like they go, "Oh, geez, how does he have that?"
It's good though. You know, I'm loving hearing this, and I'll tell you why. Because one of the things that I think has been a big shift in my gaming the last, 5 years or so, as opposed to when I was gaming in the 90s and the late 80s, is I care so much more about the story we're getting. I care so much about the story we're getting. I care about the interesting character relationships. I care about the arc. I care about cool callbacks and sweet moments. I don't care that much about the numbers and the progression, that particular itch. I scratch it occasionally with video games and board games, but in my role-playing games, I find I don't need it. And I think it's really cool that you kind of like are at that place with Mutant Year Zero too.
Well, and I think it's much more important than worrying about that to think about niche protection. That if a player has built themselves up to do X, Y, or Z, when a new player comes in and they say, "Oh, I want to do Z," then as GM you go, "Okay, this player's already doing that, so let's talk about that and being really, really good about that." I think that's a challenge. You've got to be that, and that's a little table management thing. I think that's much more important than people being different levels and earning their XP.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so Kyle, you've been listening to us go back and forth, and I consider you like one of the more knowledgeable people I know about Blades in the Dark, a game that I think is particularly good for the style of play. What's your thinking on all this?
Yeah, so I actually just started a open table Blades campaign last week. So I think, I have a lot of thoughts here about what Lil's been saying. It's been great to hear all of these strategies and ideas. Especially onboarding new players, I find that to be really interesting. As much as Blades is set up to do this kind of thing to an extent where the progression that does exist is heavily weighted towards the crew and not the PCs. And so you can have progression across multiple sessions, even if you have players changing in and out, because your tier is so powerful and it has such a huge effect on the dynamics of play. I do find that the procedures that are in the text of Blades for introducing characters or for setting up the crew are really quite cumbersome. And I am actually in the process of rewriting them in order to do more of the sort of thing that you've been talking about, Lowell, in terms of doing like post-gen, getting things moving, not overloading people with excessive questions about characters that lack context and will not be interesting until they come up at a crucial moment in play. So this has all been really, really interesting to me. The one thing that I did want to ask about with Mutant Year Zero is whether or not there's a significant faction element to play in that game.
There is, in that there are multiple bosses in the arc that are doing things. But that's one of those things where I go, okay, the assumption is that you guys know and like each other and can work with each other. So you've got to build that into whatever we're doing backstory-wise. You can't lone wolf.
Mm-hmm.
You can't be part of a rival gang. Even if you're going to be a boss, then, tell us how you're getting along. Why are you getting along with these other people? I put some of the onus on them. Whereas I think in a longer term face-to-face game, maybe there would be, or rather there could be, and there could be aggressive kind of PvP stuff. That's not on the table for the way I run it.
And I think as long as you're upfront about stuff like that, it's totally cool, right? I know that like the platonic ideal or whatever of the hobby is that we should be able to play behind our characters' eyes and go wherever we want, be whoever we want to be, do what we want to do. Sure, I love it in theory. But the fact of the matter is sometimes you need to be doing the thing, and the thing is often you all working together. The thing is often, hey, we're going to this adventure. That's the thing we're doing. We're going to this castle. We're going to this keep. And it's not railroading. It's not censoring play. It's not constrictive. It's just setting a boundary, right?
But it's a meta conversation that for a lot of players that are in a different mindset about how gameplay works, that bothers them that we go to that meta conversation. But I think it's so important. But I've gone on quite a bit here. I think the one thing I will say is, the greatest fear in my mind is that, and the one thing I don't want is for a player to come in and people to be referencing things that happened in previous episodes that they weren't present for. I think that's the thing that makes me nervous. We didn't have very much of that, and I kept a close eye on it. So I was happy about that. It's my greatest fear, I think.
Awesome. Is there anything else you want to say about this, Lowell?
No, I've talked way too long.
Kyle, do you have any more questions for Lowell?
No, but I just wanted to say that as far as the meta conversation goes, if you do have somebody bring up something from a previous session, ideally as a GM, I would like to have that player bring that to the meta level and help on board the other people in the scene in order to make that work. So I'm running Blades, and as much as that game does focus on the meta conversation in the rules, I feel like I want to push it even more that direction. I think that's only going to be towards the good for a open table group.
Everyone should be the ambassador for the game.
Yeah, I agree completely. If I can just piggyback off what you just said there, Kyle, I do that at different levels, right? I mean, there's the meta conversation you have in the beginning, even before you meet, where you're kind of like explaining things to, say, a new player. There's the conversation you have, before the session starts. There's the conversation you're having in between sessions or like in the middle of the session where you're helping shape the narrative. And indeed, and this might be helpful when you're trying to fill in those gaps for a player who hasn't been here for the last 5 or 6 sessions, in the moment, at the scene level, stop and just quickly explain what the deal is and then have them role play. Kyle, how was your March?
Good. So I got to play a number of games despite my life sort of being up in the air. I got to hop in on Tom's World of Blades campaign, which is a mashup of World of Dungeons and Blades in the Dark, and something that he has been running as an open table campaign set in Verona, Italy, with a whole bunch of OSR modules thrown in. So that has been a lot of fun, and we're actually wrapping that up tonight. So I'm looking forward to it. I got to play Infinite Galaxies this month on the Hangouts calendar, so I was glad to get to participate in that. I got to participate in a game of Poutine, which is, I believe, a game that's in playtesting still, but it's a story game, and we got to do that for one of Tyler's birthday sessions, and that was amazing. It was so good. And I got to run a game of the Veil Cascade, and that was a sort of biopunk themed one shot, and that was really cool. I love doing sort of high concept things with the Veil, so good times there. And as I mentioned, I kicked off the Blades in the Dark campaign with the ASPAC channel on Slack, so that is available for those who are interested. But what I want to talk about is Worlds of Adventure, specifically the Slaying Stone experimental series that I had on the calendar for this month. This was an attempt to do a few things. The first was to adapt a 4E module for use with Worlds of Adventure, and specifically the Slaying Stone. So the Slaying Stone is a 4E module for first-level adventurers in 4th edition D&D. Quite unusual for 4th edition because it is a point crawl, and most 4E modules tend to be a straight down the middle, here's an encounter, here's an encounter, here's an encounter kind of situation. So I felt like it was fairly well suited for doing the kind of indie games play that we do here. And I've run it once with Strike, and I've run it this one time with Worlds of Adventure.
We might have to actually unpack a little bit what Worlds of Adventure is. I don't think we've ever mentioned it once on the podcast.
Yeah, I don't know what it is.
Apologies. So Worlds of Adventure is a game that is actually still in development. I probably should have foregrounded that.
Fair enough.
But it is an attempt by members of the Dungeon World Discord channel to create a second edition of Dungeon World, more or less. And this is drawing on a number of different existing Dungeon World supplements that have been released since Dungeon World itself was published. So things like Perilous Wilds, things like Inverse World, things like Freebooters on the Frontier. All of those things are cited as sort of references and sources for what they're doing. And it makes a number of changes to the game, one of which is probably the most controversial, is to drop the traditional D&D stats. Just throw that out and replace it with your mods, your modifiers. So you +1, +2, -1, your standard PBTA kind of stuff. They've removed any mechanics in the game related to race. So I think that's kind of a positive thing in the sense that we don't really want to reinforce racism. However, I think it's also a very positive thing that they move those sort of traditional choices into your character's look. And so what that does is it completely removes any connection to the mechanics. And what I found in play is that it pushes or encourages players to make much weirder characters. So for example, in the session I just ran, we had a centaur, Blaze's centaur. And there were other people at the table who were like thinking like, oh, well, you know, I would have never expected a character like this to come into a module where we're going to be kind of crawling through a town because they're so obvious. But by removing any kind of mechanical connection, it opened up that possibility. And it really got everybody else at the table fired up to interact with this character because there's something out of the ordinary. Aside from that, I would like to highlight that the classes in this game have quite a bit of improvement to them in two particular ways. The first is that they're built in such a way as to allow different play styles. So one standout that I think people really kind of focus on is that the Ranger is no longer simply a pet character, right? So in Dungeon World, the focus is on your relationship with your pet, your animal follower, your animal companion. Whereas in Worlds of Adventure, they sort of give you the flexibility to switch that up by, you know, letting you play as your sort of typical master archer. And that seems to really hit for people. And the way they did that is by moving those choices into the sort of selections at first level that you can make and allowing you to do a selection at first level in advanced moves. Yeah, I think those are the main things I'd really like to highlight about the game that sort of sing for me. and I think are very positive.
You know, it's really interesting. I'm not super familiar with Worlds of Adventure. I know it exists, and I have glanced at the material, but I just haven't had time to really go through it and come up with an opinion about it, except to say that, you know, I think it's really interesting. One of the things that I think is both a tremendous strength of Dungeon World as written, as well as simultaneously a big problem, is that the game at its core, you know, it's doing this real basic kind of throwback D&D thing, right? And that's all great, but it's super flexible, and it's so flexible and so hackable and so homebrewable that there is this tremendous creator community that surrounds it, right? Like, I mean, the creator community around Dungeon World, in my opinion, is what kind of makes Dungeon World almost like a thing apart from other Powered by the Apocalypse games. It's one of the things that sets it apart, and I think makes Dungeon World a bad thing to slot into PBTA thinking or whatever, right? Or comparisons. And so it's really tremendous. Like, you've got this huge amount of like stuff. So like, you know, the thing you mentioned, the ranger that you can like kind of choose to, you know, be a different type of ranger or whatever. You can do that in Dungeon World too, right? You can use class warfare to build one, or you can get a different ranger playbook or whatever, right? But the downfall, of course, is that a new person entering into Dungeon World, there's a dizzying array of choice as far as like content out in the community, and it's not always entirely clear where to go to get it. And so this idea of a revised Dungeon World that takes some of the best lessons from all this stuff that's out there and kind of creates this new thing out of it, I think is a really, really interesting thing. It makes sense as a reaction to like where Dungeon World is.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that some of the movement in the community towards World of Dungeons in recent times, I suspect may be related to that diffuse nature of what is going on in Dungeon World.
You know, I'm getting so much excellent fantasy gaming play out of World of Dungeons right now. That core die mechanic does so much work. You build a custom move on top of it whenever you need it, but otherwise you're kind of good to go. And it's because those games deal with simpler themes and simpler goals and objectives. It's not like Monster Hearts, where we're trying to tell like stories of, you know, queer sexuality among like, you know, mean emotional teenagers, right? Like, it's just a different, less complex kind of thing.
Right. And what I will say to sort of bring it back to this particular series is, in choosing a game to play with this module, I specifically chose Worlds of Adventure over World of Dungeons because I wanted to emulate D&D. Like, the genre I wanted to emulate was specifically D&D style heroic fantasy, which I feel like is a very different feel from what you get out of World of Dungeons, which does feel to me, when I play it at least, much closer to first edition Dungeons and Dragons. With, you know, it's just, your characters don't feel like superheroes like they do in D&D, you know?
I am so glad that we have brought the edition wars to this. This is the most exciting change in modern gaming here.
Yes, the Dungeon World Edition wars. I'm here for it.
Yeah. You know, I went back and I play OSR Dungeon World, sort of the original first edition before they did all this others.
And I just wanted to say that Worlds of Adventure is still in heavy development, and it looks like the game's going to change a lot in 0.3. So, you know, what is this game going to look like when it actually is released? Who knows? But I've been having a good time with what it is so far.
That's awesome. Well, so, I mean, I want to give you a chance to talk about your specific adventure you kind of mentioned at the top there. Was it a satisfactory fit for what you're trying to do?
Yeah, so the main focus of this was actually less on the module and more on trying to bring this meta discussion or writer's room style of play to Dungeon World in a way that felt more comfortable for me personally than flags, because I think like actually running this was kind of inspired by a discussion we had on Slack about flags. And I was kind of like feeling that flags feel really awkward for me personally as a player. And I was trying to think about like, okay, how can I create something that does the same work of meta discussion, but feels a little bit more comfortable for me. And what I ended up doing was trying out bringing the Fates mechanic from Unbound into Worlds of Adventure and replacing bonds with that.
You might have to explain how that works. What is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So Fates are kind of meta discussion mechanic. One of the players in the game, Carcosa, came up with a really great summary for what they do. He says, what is it you would like to steal the scene for, and what is it you'd like to sit there and watch other players do? So mechanically, how that works is you, as a player, decide one thing that will happen in the adventure, and you decide one thing that will happen to another player character in the adventure. And then you have a discussion about it, and everybody kind of comes to a consensus about whether they are interested in that. And it really does have a significant impact on play in a way that maybe bonds don't, I would say. Because the players do drive towards these fates. They do try to make them happen. And more significantly, I think it really alters the way that spotlighting works in the game, because one thing that Worlds of Adventure adds is a explicitly defined spotlight mechanic, which I think is an excellent addition to the game, especially for people who are less familiar with running PBTA games. I think it's great to say, if you're in this situation, this is where you cut. This is who you go to. But adding fates, it creates an opportunity for very focused character scenes. I feel like because of the way that Dungeon World normally works, you want to be cutting constantly from character to character and make sure that everybody as a group is getting an equal spotlight. But with Fates, you get scenes that are about this character. So a really good example in the module that I just ran was we had a fighter in the party. And this fighter had a fate of having a duel with the orc chieftain. You know, very basic stuff. This is a bog standard D&D module. These are the kind of characters you expect to show up. However, we really spotlighted that duel. Like, we spent a good period of time on it, and it was just back and forth between the fighter and the orc. And the other characters were not commenting. They were not making aid moves. It was just focused on this one player and their scene. And there was a certain amount of expression at the end of play that the players who got the spotlight for those long periods said they felt bad about it. But what the response was that everybody else at the table was saying, no. We discussed this at the start of play. You had permission. You had endorsement of this idea. And I was really happy to see that scene. And that's something I didn't necessarily expect would happen when I tried to bring that into play. But the players really ran with it. And I think as long as you have a little discussion at the start of play, that expectation is there, that it's okay to get the spotlight. I think fates actually do work pretty well, just as long as you realize they're going to create a different sort of play than what you might be used to with either Dungeon World or Worlds of Adventure.
Interesting.
The last thing I'd like to mention about using fates in the game specifically was one other thing I did was to give all the GM notes for the module to the players before play.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Okay.
Like send it out a week in advance saying, this is everything in the module. This is a point crawl. You already have a lot of freedom of where you're going to go. These are the NPCs. These are the locations. Here's the 731 for this game. And that actually ended up playing a little bit different than I expected, because I thought the combination of Fates with the player knowledge of everything that was in the module would encourage a very sort of like active group-oriented approach to where the narrative was going to go, and everybody sort of being aware of what was happening, doing a writer's room style thing. But I think it actually ended up somewhere in the middle because, you know, as you were saying, Lowell, in earlier discussion, players generally won't read most of what you send out. So I think it helped because it was like, oh, here's some NPCs in this module. Here's some locations, you know, maybe check out this map. And that helped to get some ideas going for Fates. But I don't think we really hit the sort of writer's room style play that you might get in like Microscope or something like that.
That's hyper meta. That's even way more meta than anything I've ever done. And I'm a pretty, you know, kind of meta GM, you know, so that's pretty wild. Well, Kyle, thank you for introducing our listenership to Worlds of Adventure. My March was pretty good. I never played nearly as many games as Lowell does, but that's okay. I played Bluebeard's Bride. I got to play in one of Shane Liebling's Bluebeard's Bride sessions, and that was pretty cool. I ran a series called Dungeon World Legerdemain, which was inspired in part by an old Dungeon magazine module called Legerdemain. I ran Monster Hearts Camp Mercy Falls, a sort of extended two-shot of Monster Hearts in our Mercy Falls setting, which was really fun. And the thing I want to talk about is World of Dungeons Carcosa. So I have talked about Carcosa on this show 100 years ago, and so I'm not going to go into it too much, except to say that it's this bleak, inhospitable, Cthulhuid hell planet, all right? Very science fantasy, filled with all kinds of weird, gonzo, gross shit. If you want to hear more about Carcosa, I strongly recommend going to the Fear of a Black Dragon feed, where the newest episode is part 1 of Tom and I's Carcosa discussion. So I'm not going to talk about Carcosa too much. I want to talk about the World of Dungeons part and the Hexcrawl part of Carcosa. So before I kind of like get too much into the Hexcrawl stuff, I do want to talk about a couple of sort of preliminary or logistical matters that I ran into when I was getting ready to run straight Carcosa, which presumes you use it as a sort of Hexcrawl using Carcosa natives who are unusual types of characters. And so one of the things that I ran into is that World of Dungeons assumes a lot of things in the character creation, right? It assumes you are playing a fighter, a ranger, a wizard, a thief. It assumes they are humans or halflings or whatever, and that you have access to markets where you can buy goods, and it's a basic kind of fantasy thing. That does not work in Carcosa because Carcosa is a beyond post-apocalyptic setting. I mean, it is empty and bleak. And so I had to do some different things. And so what I did was I limited character selection to just fighter and thief and sorcerer, which is a new one. So fighter and thief and sorcerer are the 3 classes in the Carcosa book. I allowed the normal fighter thief Wodu creation, and then I made a new class, a sorcerer class, using the rules in World of Dungeons for creating classes. And then what I did is I put together a custom procedure that was used in conjunction with the World of Dungeon rule set in order to create characters. And this was super helpful because it kind of helped me get the character creation I needed to run this in the way that Carcosa, the book, like implies that you are to run it, right? Like it's like straight Carcosa. And so they had to choose the color of their Carcosan. They had to choose their alignment. And in Carcosa, the only thing that matters in alignment is your feelings on the great old ones of the Cthulhu mythos. I created a little psionics table to determine if your character had psionics. I made some rules for psionics as well, that fit with World of Dungeons. I limited the equipment pick list to a very, very small number of items that the characters could have scavenged. And then I created percentile rolls for different aspects of the setting that the players might already know about or be able to interact with. Rumors, sorceress rituals, space alien technology, desert lotus powder, and ancient alien tech from 2 of the previously colonizing races of the Carcosa planet, the Great Race and the Primordial ones. So I created this whole little document. I'll have a link to it in the show notes, but it is highly functional. You could, if you want to run World of Dungeons, if you want to run a Carcosa Hexcrawl with World of Dungeons, go grab that document and follow the instructions I have there. It's going to work just fine. I've run it. I've play tested it. It is A-okay. So I want to talk about Hexcrawls. So I ran a Hexcrawl. It is the first time in all of my GMing I have ever run a Hexcrawl. It's the first time I've ever played in a Hexcrawl. I have no Hexcrawl experience prior to this. And so I ran into some problems initially. The first problem was, where do I even start? There are, hundreds of hexes. Like, where do I put them? What do we actually do? And this problem was compounded by the fact that in the setting, Carcosa natives are highly xenophobic and don't talk to each other, especially if they are of different colors. And they're scared of everything and they hide because there's all these monstrosities on the planet. So I had this like real basic problem of, what the hell are these people even doing together? Where are they at? And the later problem, what do they do then? Why do they move to the next hex? Like, what causes them to move? It was just such a different way of like setting up a game for me, but I figured it out. So what I did, my solution was I went through the hexes, I read the hexes, and I found one hex where there is a 10,000-year-old purple ooze being. And I was like, 10,000-year-old being. I bet they know a lot about the history and the planet of Carcosa. And so I made the player characters, I framed them up to be pilgrims going to ask this being a question. And that was great. And then my next problem of, well, once I put them in a hex, how do we determine where they go? Like, what gets them moving in the Hexcrawl? The questions they all had about their characters, the answers were conveniently all pointing in one direction. So they were able to just get going right away. It solved what I anticipated would be like a weird consensus problem of like where to move and what to do. So yeah, that was kind of an interesting thing because, I'm so used to creating a fantasy adventure where I put together like a kind of skeleton adventure structure. I do some fronts maybe if if I'm in a place where I can kind of do fronts and then we just fill in the gaps. This idea of like, we're just going to move from place to place and see what happens is so different for me.
I love that your solution is an ancient one because in effect you're writing the Carcosa Berry Tales, right?
Oh my God. And with that, one other point I want to make. The Die of Fate. We've talked about the Die of Fate before, but it's basically this D6 that you roll in World of Dungeons. And whenever the characters move into a new encounter or a new place or whatever, and depending on the die result, it's either an easy encounter or a harder encounter, right? And that actually was really functional for the Hexcrawl because basically every time they moved into a new hex, I rolled the Die of Fate. I looked at the entry on that hex and I just made a judgment call, like if there was a treasure in that hex, but also a monster and they got a 6, which is a good result for them, they just found the treasure and that was it. And they got to keep going. If they got like a 3 or a 4, they found the monster and the treasure, right? If they got a 1 or a 2, maybe it was just the monster and maybe the monster got the jump on them, right? So that actually worked really nice. And, as I've said before, I love the exercise of playing with the Die of Fate, so that was great fun. I've actually still got one more session of this. I'm not quite done yet, and I think it's going okay. I wouldn't say I'm in love with it because there were parts of the Hexcrawl where it was just kind of, I don't think boring is the right word, but it just felt so unstructured to me, like we're just moving from this weird random encounter to this next weird random encounter. I don't know, like for a while I was like, well, this is interesting, but like, it doesn't feel like a story, And so what I ended up doing ultimately at the last session was that they arrived in a hex with 300 orange men led by an individual called the Resplendent Sun. And that was all I needed to have like a little location based encounter thing, and so we got some role play out of that and we were doing some cool things there. But it kind of reminds me of this Slack conversation that we had, yesterday or today, I think, as of the day of this recording. Horst Wurst and he's a big OSR guy, Horst is. He brought up the fact that one of the big differences between, say, story gamers and OSR gamers is story gamers want to make everything fit into a story. Like, we need to bend and shape this so that we get a story out of it, right? Whereas in his estimation, the OSR gamer, it's more about like the world being uncaring and objective, and you just whatever the story is whatever happens is what the story is, right? And so that really that idea of that split in thinking was kind of came to the fore for me.
And I've always read it in some ways as whether the characters matter or not.
Exactly right. Yeah,
I mean, that's always the thing is, if the characters matter, that's a very different game than if they don't. If the world just exists completely objectively and the thing is going on, it doesn't matter who you slot in.
Yeah, and it's a big stark difference, and I think that's why in the beginning of the Hexcrawl portion, it just felt so unmoored to me. It was like, well, it's like it was cool things were happening, but it didn't feel like a story to me, and it didn't start to feel like a story until they got somewhere where they could have like more role play, get more of their personal motivations involved. But overall, I'm having a good time with it. It's been a fun little experiment. I'm happy to see how it wraps up for sure.
Cool.
Let's go take a look at April. Hi listeners, I want to tell you about the newest issue of Codex, Codex Love 2. It's a sequel to the original Codex Love, and it has a lot of really fantastic features, including The Final Girl, a game of love, a hack of the classic horror movie game The Final Girl, but for reality dating shows like The Bachelor and Flavor of Love. And Then They Met, an original 2-player story game about a couple destined to fall in love, but that takes place entirely in the weeks and days leading up to the first time they lay eyes on each other. Willow Bluff, a queer-themed town for the classic game Dogs in the Vineyard. The newest Gauntlet daddy, Sir Barrick, and his lovely companion, Gwyn. 3 dozen men who need to be rescued. 7 original illustrations. And a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey, whose work was recently seen in the smash hit Legacy 2E. To get Codex Love 2, just make a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by April 30th. That's at patreon.com/Gauntlet. And don't forget, Codex back issues are now available on Drive-Thru RPG. Thanks. All right, Lowell, what's looking good on the April calendar?
So Richard Ruane is running the Black Hack under the Hellbridge, and this I grew up. I learned D&D in the 1970s. My sister is 5 years older than me. She taught me. She had all of this City State of the Invincible Overlord maps. It was the coolest thing. I could never look at them. And I love that this city that has existed in all these various D&D editions and so on, and Richard is taking from that and running Black Hack in there. And I think that's tremendously cool to see that. And I love urban games anyway. So very, very excited about that.
Awesome. And Richard knows OSR, old school stuff like House Down Boots. He's good at it. So cool. Kyle, what's looking good on the calendar?
I wanted to highlight Shane's Space Wurm versus Moonicorn game. I think Shane is a really fantastic GM, and I'm interested in this game, which, everybody's probably played on this podcast and everybody talks about a lot, but like, it's such a bizarre take on Dungeon World that it really, really gets my interest.
Awesome. I am looking at Lady Blackbird, Flight of the Owl, a series being run by Sydney Icarus. The reason why this is interesting to me, a couple of things. One, it's just further evidence that the OSPAC crowd is really killing it. I mean, Jesus Christ, they are like really, really killing it. Kyle's part of that crowd too. So Kyle, you're included in that, of course.
You're too kind.
Really killing it as far as like getting games on the calendar, getting ad hoc games, calendared games, all of it. So it's pretty sweet. But also there's been a lot of like resurgent interest in Lady Blackbird from a RPG theory standpoint happening in our Slack lately. And it's not just because Slackbot wants us to be talking about Lady Blackbird. And so I think it's really fun that like, it's one of those like, it's just such a classic Gauntlet moment, right? Of like, we are talking about this thing from a theory perspective. We're loving it. We're talking about it. Oh, let's go run it. Right. And, it's just got that great. It's kind of what we do. And I love it. Let's go to Giving Me Life. It's Giving Me Life. I'm going to start. Twitter. Shockingly, I'm the only person for whom Twitter is giving life in existence. So I've been like really, really like pushing our Twitter presence for the Gauntlet, and I really like it. I'm discovering that Twitter is actually like kind of a perfect medium for me to communicate right now about the Gauntlet and about like kind of what we're up to, because I don't have super huge amounts of time to do big long G+ posts anymore, and so a little quick Twitter hit, a little pithy, funny, witty thing with a link works great. and I'm getting to meet so many new people, just interacting with so many new people discovering what we do. I'm really loving the activity right now on our Twitter. Lowell, what's giving you life?
So I kind of skipped over talking about Cypher System, but I do want to mention one of the games I ran was Unmasked. It's Stranger Things meets Legion meets Young Justice kind of setting for Cypher. It's a superhero 1980 game. The setting is really cool. There's lots of good stuff in there. And I don't usually kind of push the, people to watch the videos of my games, but I will say the last 2 sessions of that Unmasked game, holy cow, all kinds of great 80s stuff, good interactions, this oblique reference to the AIDS crisis and just some really good, after a session, I'm usually like, oh, that was pretty good. After the last session, I was like, oh, that hit. That
Nice.
Landed exactly like I wanted it to. So I recommend checking out that setting. And if you like videos, checking out those videos.
Yeah, I love that feeling when you have something in your mind and then it goes the way you want it to, and you're like, oh, yes. So good. Kyle, what's giving you life?
Well, I just picked the Gauntlet in general. I think it was literally giving me life this month because, I went through 2 of probably some of the worst months of my life, and I got to run something like 4 games with Gauntlet people towards the end of this month, and I just felt so revitalized by that, and especially want to shout out Tyler's birthday game of poutine, and huge thanks to Lauren for organizing
Awesome.
that.
I'm reminded of something that Jim Crocker said somewhere, maybe on G+, I can't remember, but he said something that I just found super touching, and it kind of piggybacks off what you just said, which was that Gauntlet Hangouts and kind of being a part of our community is the first time he's gotten to enjoy or do the hobby for himself in like 20 years. Jim, of course, runs a game store called Modern Myths. And so a lot of his interaction with the hobby is work and professional and maybe not so fun. Right. So I love that, we're able to give that kind of experience to people with the way we do things. Well, listeners, that's our show. If you want to get in touch with us, I recommend going to G+ and searching the community section of G+ for the Gauntlet. You'll find us there. We're on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com, and we are on Patreon at patreon.com/Gauntlet. Lowell, thanks so much.
Why, thank you, Jason.
Kyle, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
And listeners, thanks for listening. Take care.